My best friend of 40 years waited 4 decades for me to die, and he did not even have the decency to wait for my pulse to stop before he moved into my house, took my wife, and stole my business while I was hooked up to a ventilator. They thought I was a vegetable, a hollow shell of a man with a rotted brain. But they forgot one thing. Vegetables have ears, and I heard every single word of their disgusting betrayal. For 6 months, I was a prisoner in my own skin, listening to Steve and Sarah whisper about how much easier life would be once the plug was finally pulled on Jack. They spoke about me like I was already trash waiting for the pickup, all while Steve wore my silk pajamas and drank the vintage scotch I had been saving for my retirement. The accident happened on a rainy Tuesday, a blur of screeching tires and cold metal that sent me into a void of darkness. I spent half a year in that gray space between life and death, hearing the hum of the machines and the hushed tones of nurses. But it was the voices of my wife and my brother by choice that truly woke me up. They did not talk about memories or hope. They talked about deeds, bank accounts, and when the insurance check would clear. Steve and I were inseparable since we were 20. We built a construction empire from a single rusty truck and a dream. I shared everything with him. I gave him a seat at my table and a key to my front door. I thought our bond was forged in iron, but it turns out it was just a long game for him. He was a parasite, a cuckoo bird, waiting for the owner of the nest to fall so he could take over the territory. When I finally opened my eyes in that hospital bed, a week earlier than the doctors predicted, I did not call out. I did not make a sound. I let the doctors think I was still drifting, because I needed to see the crime scene my life had become with my own eyes. I needed to see just how deep the knife went. The day I was discharged, I did not call for a ride. I took a cab and walked up my driveway like a ghost, returning to haunt his own halls. I did not even have to use my key because the front door was unlocked, as if the new master of the house felt perfectly secure. The smell of my favorite steak dinner wafted through the air, but it was not for me. It was for the man who was currently sitting in my leather armchair, his feet up on my table, looking at my wife with a hunger that had clearly been suppressed for a long, long time. My heart did not just break. It turned into a cold, hard stone. I stood in the shadows of the hallway, watching them. Sarah looked younger, happier, as if my near-death experience had been a rejuvenating spa treatment for her. She leaned down and kissed Steve, a deep and lingering kiss that told me everything I needed to know about what had been happening while I was fighting for my breath. Then she asked the question that sealed her fate. "Love, should we replace Jack's mattress today, or just wait until the weekend after the estate sale?" Steve laughed, a sound that used to bring me comfort, but now made my skin crawl. He told her there was no rush, because the old man was never coming back to claim it anyway. They had no idea that the old man was standing 10 feet away, and he was about to become their worst nightmare. I stood there in the dark hallway, a shadow in my own home, watching the two people I loved most plan the disposal of my life. The air felt heavy, thick with the scent of a dinner I wasn't invited to. Steve looked so comfortable in my chair. He was wearing my favorite blue robe, the one my father gave me before he passed. To see his treacherous hands touching the fabric made my blood boil. He reached out and squeezed Sarah's hand, and the way she looked at him made me realize that this affair didn't start while I was in a coma. It had been rotting under the surface of my marriage for years. I backed away slowly, slipping out the front door before they could spot me. My legs were weak from months of disuse, but the adrenaline gave me a temporary strength I didn't know I possessed. I checked into a cheap motel across town, using a credit card they had forgotten to cancel. I sat on the edge of the stained bed, staring at the peeling wallpaper, and let the reality sink in. My business, my home, my wife, even my clothes were being consumed by a man I called a brother. The next morning, I began my reconnaissance. I couldn't just walk in and scream. If I did that, they would find a way to make me look crazy or incompetent. I needed to know exactly how much they had stolen. I spent the day at a public library, using their computers to check my business filings. What I found was a punch to the gut. Steve had used a power of attorney Sarah signed to remove my name from the board of directors. He had effectively evicted me from my own company while I was staring at a hospital ceiling. The most painful part was seeing my dog, Buster. I drove past the house later that evening and saw Steve in the yard. He was trying to get Buster to fetch a ball. Buster is a loyal golden retriever who used to follow me everywhere. I watched from a distance as my dog backed away, tail between his legs, growling low in his throat. Steve lost his temper and shouted at him, pointing a finger aggressively. Sarah came out and rubbed Steve's shoulders, telling him the dog would eventually learn who the new boss was. That was the moment I stopped feeling sad and started feeling dangerous. They wanted my life, but they didn't realize that the man who built that life was a fighter. I wasn't just going to take it back. I was going to make them wish they had never met me. I decided then that I wouldn't reveal my recovery yet. I needed to be a ghost. I needed to see every lie they told and every penny they spent. I started by visiting an old contact in the tech world, someone who owed me a favor from years ago. I needed eyes and ears inside that house, and I needed them immediately. The game was no longer about survival. It was about a total, calculated reclamation. I was going to be the silent witness to my own replacement until the moment was right to strike. The motel room was cold, but the fire burning in my chest kept me awake. I contacted an old friend named Marcus, a guy who specialized in high-end home security. I told him I suspected my wife was seeing someone, and I needed proof before the divorce. It was a half-truth, but it was enough to get him to work fast. While Steve and Sarah were out celebrating their newfound freedom at a fancy downtown restaurant, Marcus and I entered my home through the back entrance. It felt surreal to be a burglar in the house I had paid off 10 years ago. We worked in total silence. Marcus installed tiny pinhole cameras in the living room, the kitchen, and most importantly, the master bedroom. He set up a hidden network that allowed me to stream everything directly to my tablet. As I stood in my bedroom, I saw a framed photo of Steve and Sarah on my nightstand. They had already removed my picture and tucked it away in a drawer like a shameful secret. I reached into the back of my closet and found a small floor safe they clearly hadn't discovered yet. Inside was a backup hard drive and a ledger of cash reserves I kept for emergencies. Just as we were finishing, I heard a car pull into the driveway. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. We slipped out through the basement door just as the front lock clicked open. I sat in my car a block away, opening the app on my tablet. The screen flickered to life, showing Steve and Sarah entering the house. They were laughing, both of them slightly tipsy from expensive wine bought with my money. Steve threw my father's robe onto the floor and pulled Sarah close. I watched through the screen as they sat on the sofa, clutching a stack of legal papers. Sarah mentioned that the doctors seemed surprised by my brain activity before I was moved, but Steve just waved her off. He told her that even if I woke up, I would be a vegetable who couldn't remember his own name. He said the transition of the business assets was almost complete, and that by next month, Jack would be nothing more than a bad memory and a line in a ledger. The coldness of their calculation was terrifying. They weren't just dealing with an affair. This was a hostile takeover of a human life. I watched them toast to their future, clinking glasses over the documents that stripped me of everything I had worked for since I was 20. My hand trembled as I held the tablet, but it wasn't from fear. It was the pure, unfiltered anticipation of the trap I was beginning to set. The next morning, I watched the live feed from my tablet. Seeing my house from the perspective of a hidden camera felt like watching a twisted reality show. Steve was in the kitchen, casually tossing my expensive coffee beans into the grinder. He was complaining about the brand, telling Sarah they should switch to something more exclusive now that they had the budget for it. Sarah was leaning against the counter, wearing a silk nightgown I had bought her for our anniversary. The betrayal took a sharper turn when Steve started talking about my clothes. He went to the hallway closet and began pulling out my custom-tailored suits. He held one up against his chest and scoffed, saying I always had terrible taste in patterns. He told Sarah he was going to call a tailor to come over and take in the waistlines so he could wear them to the board meeting next week. Sarah just laughed and said she didn't care what he did with the rags. As long as he looked like the CEO everyone expected him to be. The casualness of their theft was what stung the most. Later that afternoon, Steve opened my heavy oak desk, a piece of furniture that was supposed to be private. He was digging through my files, tossing birth certificates and old property deeds aside like they were trash. He was looking for the physical stock certificates for our company. I saw him find a folder and let out a triumphant shout. He called Sarah over and showed her the documents. He explained that since she had the power of attorney, all she had to do was sign the transfer of shares. He told her that once the signature was dry, Jack would officially be a ghost in his own company. Sarah hesitated for a split second, asking if there was any chance the hospital would call with an update. Steve grabbed her shoulders and looked her dead in the eyes. He told her that even if I opened my eyes, I wouldn't know the difference between a dollar bill and a napkin. The power dynamic in my house was shifting in a way that made my stomach churn. I watched through the cameras as Steve tried to assert dominance over my dog, Buster. Buster is an old soul, a golden retriever who has been my shadow for 7 years. On the screen, I saw Steve trying to force Buster into the garage. He wanted the dog out of the way because Sarah complained about the shedding on the new white rugs they had bought with my savings. Buster wouldn't budge. He stood his ground near the door of my home office, low growls vibrating in his chest. Steve grew red in the face, his eyes bulging with a petty rage. He grabbed Buster by the collar and tried to drag him. Sarah walked into the frame, crossing her arms. She told Steve to just leave the animal alone for now, saying that once the final papers were signed, they could just drop the dog off at a shelter and tell the neighbors he ran away from grief. The coldness in her voice chilled me more than the motel air conditioning ever could. Steve finally let go of the collar and kicked at the air near Buster's face, cursing my name. He shouted that everything in this house belonged to him now. He started pacing the living room, talking about how he was going to remodel the entire floor. He wanted to tear down the walls of my office to make a larger bar area for the parties he planned to host. I realized then that Steve didn't just want my money. He wanted to erase every physical trace of me. He started throwing my old trophies and mementos into a black trash bag. Each clatter of metal against plastic felt like a strike against my soul. He picked up a hand-carved wooden clock my father had made and weighed it in his hand before tossing it carelessly into the bag. They were so convinced of their victory that they had become sloppy and arrogant. I knew I needed more than just a video. I needed the smoking gun. While they were away for a weekend, I returned to the house and went for the old laptop I had kept in the attic. I spent hours bypassing old passwords. When I finally got in, I found a hidden folder. Steve had been documenting his resentment for years. He wrote about how I was the face of the company, while he was the muscle. He wrote about how I had the beautiful wife he deserved. One specific entry from 10 years ago was a list of my habits, my health issues, and even the routes I took to work. He was waiting for a moment of weakness. It wasn't a sudden betrayal. It was a long-term, predatory obsession. The most damning evidence was a recent chat log between him and Sarah. Steve told her to keep quiet and sign whatever he put in front of her. He instructed her to choose a care facility with the worst reputation for recovery. They wanted me buried alive. I copied every single file onto an encrypted drive. The time for hiding was over. I called Sarah from the hospital lobby, pretending I had just been released. When I arrived at the front door, Steve and Sarah looked like they had seen a ghost. I walked into my living room, leaning heavily on a cane I didn't actually need. I began the act of a man whose brain was half fried. I called Steve by the wrong name and asked why there were boxes in the hallway. The relief that washed over their faces was disgusting. Over the next few days, I stayed in the house, acting like a confused guest. Steve would walk right past me, carrying my things to the garage, assuming I didn't understand. He even had the audacity to sit at the dinner table and explain that he was staying over to help with my recovery because I was too weak to be alone. Sarah would play the devoted wife in front of the neighbors, then ignore me the second the door was closed. Steve was becoming bolder. One afternoon, he walked over to me with a stack of papers and told me they were insurance forms. They were actually a final transfer of the house title. My hand shook as I took the pen, and I scrawled a signature that looked messy and incoherent, just enough to keep the game going. Sarah entered the room and told me we were going to have a big dinner party on Friday to celebrate my homecoming. Steve laughed and said it would be a night to remember. They wanted a public display of my incompetence to cement Steve's role as the new head of the family. That night, I checked my hidden server. The recordings were crystal clear. I had them on tape, discussing how they would slowly increase my medication after the party to keep me quiet. I packed the digital files and sent them to my lawyer with a simple instruction: wait for my signal. The night of the dinner party arrived. Steve was the life of the party, wearing my favorite charcoal suit. He stood up and clinked his glass for a toast. He talked about the burden of taking over the company to save my legacy. He looked down at me and said that even though Jack might not understand, we will always care for him. That was the moment I chose to stop being a ghost. I stood up from the wheelchair slowly and walked to the center of the table. I reached over and tapped a button on the smart home hub. The large television in the dining room flickered to life. The entire room watched in horror as the screen showed Steve and Sarah laughing about my accident and discussing how they would sedate me after the party. The silence that followed was deafening. Steve tried to lunge for the hub, but two off-duty police officers I had invited as guests stepped forward. I looked at Steve and told him that my shoes never fit him because he was too small to ever walk in my path. I handed the lead officer a folder containing the proof of their fraud. As the handcuffs clicked onto Steve's wrists, I felt the weight of 40 years of lies lift off my shoulders. The police led Steve and Sarah out of the house in front of everyone. Sarah was hysterical, but her voice felt like static. I walked to the fireplace and threw the silk robe into the flames. In the months that followed, I took back full control of my company. I sold the big house and moved to a smaller place near the coast with Buster. I realized that 62 is not the end of the road. It is just the beginning. Now that you have heard my story, I have to ask, do you think I was too cold in the way I exposed them? Did I do the right thing by letting them think I was a vegetable just to catch them in the act? What would you have done if you woke up and found your entire life had been stolen by the person you trusted most? If you enjoyed this story of justice and reclamation, please subscribe to the channel so you never miss another incredible tale. Hit the like button to support the channel and leave a comment below with your thoughts on my revenge. Your support helps me keep sharing these stories with the world. The end. Thank you for listening.